It was one of those cold winter nights when silence wraps around everything like a thick blanket. The sky was dark, the air heavy with fog, and the old town train station looked more abandoned than usual. A man named Arjun stood on the emptier platform, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. He had missed his regular evening train due to a last-minute meeting and now had no choice but to take the final train out. The midnight one, rarely used, rarely seen, and always spoken about in hushed voices by the older locals. The stories about that train were many, but Arjun had always laughed them off. Tonight, however, the laughter was gone, and only the echo of distant memories remained. Only two other figures waited on the platform. One was a hunched old man wearing a long, dusty coat, a hat pulled low over his face. He stood completely still, as though frozen in place. The other was a tall woman with a large suitcase by her side. Her face was turned away, eyes fixed on the empty tracks. Neither of them spoke, and neither looked around. Their presence was unsettling, but Arjun said nothing. He simply kept checking the time, his breath forming little clouds in the freezing air. The train finally arrived, but something about it felt off. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the platform. The engine made a low, groaning sound, as though the metal itself was in pain. It rolled in slowly, and Arjun watched as the doors opened with a loud hiss. He turned to glance at the old man and the woman, but they were already stepping in, quiet, as ghosts. Without a word, he followed. Inside, the train was dimly lit and smelled of rust and something else he couldn't quite name. It was sharp, metallic, with a hint of something rotten underneath. He moved down the narrow corridor, trying to find a clean, quiet spot. The seats were worn, some torn, and many windows were fogged up so badly nothing could be seen outside. After passing through two empty coaches, he finally chose a seat near a window in Coach D. He placed his bag on the floor and sank into the seat, exhausted. Outside, the fog was so thick it looked like the train was swimming through a sea of ghosts. The train began to move, but the ride was far from smooth. It shook slightly, groaned often, and something about its motion felt wrong, like it wasn't following the tracks properly. Arjun looked around and noticed how eerily silent it was inside. Not a whisper, not a breath, not a single sign of life, apart from his own. For the first time that night, a strange unease crawled into his chest. Something about this journey felt unnatural, and somewhere deep in his gut, a warning bell had started to ring, softly at first, but getting louder with every passing second. The train's motion grew even more unsettling, rocking back and forth in an unnatural rhythm. Arjun shifted in his seat, unable to shake the strange feeling gnawing at him. He glanced out the window, hoping to find something familiar, but the fog had thickened, swallowing any trace of the outside world. The trees seemed to blur together, forming a dark, endless wall of shapes. He tried to focus on the sound of the train itself, the steady clattering of the wheels against the tracks, but it wasn't enough to calm him. His eyes darted nervously around the coach. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old leather and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. After a few minutes of trying to settle his nerves, Arjun stood up. The silence of the train was almost suffocating, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He decided to move through the coaches, hoping to find some sign of life, something to remind him that he wasn't trapped in this train by himself. As he passed through the narrow aisle, he noticed that the doors to the other coaches were old-fashioned, with metal handles that squeaked when he touched them. The flickering lights overhead cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and curl unnaturally along the walls. His steps echoed through the empty hallways, but when he reached the next coach, he found it just as deserted. The seats were empty, the windows fogged over, and no sign of anyone who might have gotten on. He moved to the next coach, then the one after, his unease growing with each step. Every coach he passed seemed colder, darker, more isolated. It was as though the train was never ending, stretching out far beyond the space it should occupy. Finally, after walking through what felt like half the train, Arjun came to a stop. His heart raced as his eyes swept across the next empty coach. It was the same. No passengers, no sounds, just the cold, empty seats lined up in rows. He leaned back against the doorframe and took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. But before he could turn around and head back to his seat, something caught his attention. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking toward him. He turned sharply, his pulse quickening, but when he looked down the corridor, no one stood there. His breath caught in his throat. The sound continued, closer now, just behind him, like someone walking in the same direction, matching his pace. He turned again, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was still nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He could hear them now, each step heavy and deliberate. But when Arjun turned back toward the hallway, the train was still empty. The hairs on his neck stood on end. It wasn't the train's movement or the strange sounds. It was the feeling that something was there, watching him, following him. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks, he knew one thing for sure. The train was far from ordinary. Something was wrong. The silence that had followed the footsteps seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. Arjun stood frozen, his eyes scanning the corridor, every nerve on edge. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. The atmosphere inside the train had shifted, the air colder, heavier, and thick with something that couldn't be explained. A chill ran down his spine as he took another step forward, his shoes clicking against the metal floor. The sound echoed in the quiet, amplifying his fear with every passing second. He kept walking, hoping to find someone, anyone who could explain what was happening, but the train felt endless. The more he moved, the more it seemed like the train stretched out, the coaches seemingly leading nowhere. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached the end of the coach. That's when he saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. At first he thought it was just another passenger, maybe someone who had boarded without his notice. But something wasn't right. The figure stood perfectly still, as if frozen in place, motionless and unnervingly silent. Arjun tried to make out the details, but the figure was shrouded in darkness. The faint light from the overhead bulb above flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the figure, but it did little to illuminate the details. Arjun felt a tightening in his chest, his breath coming faster. He could feel his pulse in his throat as he watched the figure. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but nothing about the situation added up. Something felt wrong, dread clawing at him from the inside. Then, slowly, the figure turned. It faced him, and Arjun's stomach dropped. The man, or what looked like a man, had no face, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just smooth, stretched skin where a face should have been. It was as though the skin had been pulled tight, featureless, like something that had been skinned and left empty. The light in the corridor flickered again, and for a brief moment, the man's featureless face seemed to shimmer, as if something was moving beneath the surface of his skin. A chill spread through Arjun's body, his breath catching in his throat. His legs went weak, but he couldn't look away. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body remained rooted to the spot. Paralyzed by fear, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him with that empty, blank face. Arjun's mouth went dry, and he took a slow, cautious step backward, his instincts telling him to get away. But the train seemed to close in on him. The air felt stifling, oppressive, as though the entire train was holding its breath. He tried to blink, to clear his vision. But when he opened his eyes again, the figure was gone. vanished. There was nothing but the empty, cold corridor stretching out in front of him. His heart raced as he looked around, every shadow now threatening, every creak of the train making him jump. The fear coursed through him like ice water. He knew then, without a doubt, that something in this train was terribly wrong. Arjun stumbled back down the corridor, his heart racing, the chill of fear settling deep in his bones. Every step he took felt heavy, as if the train itself were dragging him along. He tried to shake off the image of the faceless man, but the memory clung to him like a dark shadow, every part of him screaming to escape. He reached the next door to another coach, his mind set on finding something familiar, anything that would tell him that he wasn't alone in this nightmare. The door was locked, the handle stiff, resisting his efforts. Panic began to rise in his chest as he tried again, pulling harder, but it didn't budge. Each tug felt like an eternity, the metal creaking in protest. But no matter how forcefully he yanked, the door remained firmly shut. Desperation took over, and Arjun turned to the next door, his hands trembling. The same result. Locked. His breath quickened, each failed attempt pulling him deeper into a void of dread. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the sound of his own voice seemed lost in the oppressive silence of the train. The lights above flickered again, casting eerie, distorted shadows along the walls, warping the space around him. He could feel his mind unraveling, the pressure of the empty train pressing in on him from all sides. His eyes darted back to the door. He stepped away from it, breathing heavily, his mind racing. There had to be another way. He couldn't just stay here. He couldn't be trapped on this train with whatever was lurking within it. Turning around, he moved back to the coach where he had first entered, praying it wasn't just an illusion. He needed to find a way out. He needed to escape. As he approached the door, something caught his eye. Another door down the hall, farther, down the corridor, standing open. The faintest light glowed from within the next coach, promising some form of escape, or at the very least, some sort of relief. His feet moved instinctively toward it, every step feeling like it required every ounce of strength he had left. When Arjun reached the doorway, he stopped, unable to believe what he was seeing. The open door led into a coach that looked completely different from the others. It was brighter, almost too bright, and the air inside was warm, comforting even, like stepping into a safe haven after hours of being lost in the dark. The seats in this coach were pristine, the floor spotless, and the windows, there were windows, clean and clear. He felt a flicker of hope, the first one he'd felt since boarding this nightmare of a train. But then he hesitated. Something felt off, like he was being drawn into a trap. His hand hovered over the door frame, ready to step inside, but the moment he crossed the threshold, he froze. The man with no face stood in the center of the coach. His presence filled the space, suffocating it. His smooth, featureless face locked onto Arjun, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. The door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside with the faceless figure. The train began to move faster, too fast, shaking violently as it sped through the dark night. The lights flickered once more, plunging the coach into an almost complete darkness. Arjun's body trembled, his breath shallow as he faced the horror of his nightmare. There was no escape now. The darkness that followed the slamming of the door seemed to press in from all sides, suffocating the air in the coach. Arjun stood frozen in place, his pulse hammering in his ears, as the faceless man moved slowly toward him, the absence of features on his face more terrifying than anything he could imagine. The shadows in the coach stretched long and twisted, distorting everything in the dim light. He could hear his breath, shallow and ragged, and the soft scrape of his shoes against the floor as he tried to back away, but his legs refused to move. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, his hands trembling. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body remained locked in place, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the creature before him. The air was thick with a strange, unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the train's movement. The figure's steps were slow but deliberate, and with each one, Arjun's fear deepened. Then came the whispers. They were so faint at first that Arjun thought he had imagined them, the softest murmur like a breath just beyond hearing. He turned his head, straining to listen, but the whispers grew louder. They came from everywhere, seeping through the walls, curling around him like a serpent. Arjun's heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat as the whispers began to form words, barely audible at first, but growing clearer by the second. The voice sounded familiar, but twisted, as though it had been distorted by something, dark and ancient. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, the words crawling through his mind like ice, freezing him in place. The faceless man's figure loomed closer, and the whispers grew more frantic, louder, as though the train itself was alive, speaking to him from the very walls. "You're trapped," the voice continued, each word cutting through him like a blade. "You should never have boarded." The figure in front of him didn't move its lips, but the voice seemed to come from it, a horrible, guttural tone that twisted the words beyond recognition. Arjun wanted to scream, to run, to break free from the nightmare that had him in its grip, but his voice wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his body frozen, as the whispers filled his mind, the sound of his own terror amplifying with each passing second. Suddenly, the faceless man reached out, its hands long and skeletal, its fingers impossibly thin. Arjun recoiled, but his legs refused to obey. The creature's hands grazed his skin, sending a chill through his body. The touch was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt. As its hands closed around him, the whispers grew deafening, swirling, in his mind, overwhelming him. The train continued to rattle and shake, but it all seemed distant now, as though the world outside no longer mattered. The only thing that existed was the faceless man and the crushing weight of the voices surrounding him. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent. The train ceased its rattling. Arjun opened his eyes, not sure when he had closed them, and found himself back at the beginning, standing alone in the empty coach. The figure was gone, and the silence felt even more suffocating than before. Arjun's mind was a haze, the confusion settling deeper with every passing second. He blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The darkness that had engulfed him was gone, and the once empty coach was now eerily still, as if nothing had ever moved. The faceless figure was nowhere to be seen, and for a brief moment, Arjun thought he might have imagined it all. Maybe the whispers, the strange encounter, and the suffocating atmosphere had just been a product of his fear, his mind playing tricks on him. But the oppressive silence, thick like fog, told him otherwise. Something was terribly wrong. The train had stopped moving, no longer rattling along the tracks as it had before. Everything was eerily still, too still. Arjun's heartbeat quickened as he stood in the empty coach, the oppressive weight of isolation pressing in on him. He knew deep down that the nightmare was far from over. Without thinking, he walked toward the door, his hands trembling as they gripped the cold metal handle. He pulled it open and stepped into the next coach, hoping that this time there would be a way out. But what greeted him was not the comfort of escape, but an endless stretch of darkness. The lights flickered briefly, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. The air was thick with a musty, metallic smell that clung to his clothes. It felt as if the train had become a labyrinth, a maze that led nowhere, trapping him in a nightmare with no exit. Arjun's legs felt like lead, and his breathing became shallow as he moved down the corridor. He had no clear destination, no real plan, just the overwhelming urge to keep moving, to find something familiar, anything that could pull him out of this twisted reality. Then he heard it again, the soft, faint whispers, this time more urgent, more insistent. "It's too late," they said, the voice a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the train. "You should have listened." Arjun's stomach churned as the whispers grew louder, pressing into his mind, drowning out all rational thought. He covered his ears, but the voices only grew louder, more frantic. He wanted to scream, to break free from the nightmare, but the words stuck in his throat, caught like a choking sob. His legs trembled, his vision blurred as the darkness seemed to close in on him. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The train was no longer just a machine. It had become something alive, something that fed on fear, trapping its passengers in a never-ending cycle of terror. Suddenly, the train lurched forward, a violent jolt that threw Arjun off balance. He stumbled, his hands scraping against the walls as the train picked up speed. The lights flickered once more, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the faceless man standing at the end of the corridor, just out of reach. But when he blinked, the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the sound of the train speeding faster and faster into the unknown. Arjun had no idea where this train was headed, but deep down, he knew it was a place from which there was no return. The train raced through the endless night, its speed unnerving, as if it were driven by a force far beyond anything human. Arjun clung to the nearest seat, his body tossed and jerked with every turn, the lights above flickering sporadically. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the violent shuddering of the train. Time had lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps it was seconds that felt like eternity. Every part of him screamed to escape, but his legs refused to cooperate, locked in a terror so deep that his body felt paralyzed. The whispers, ever present, filled his ears with their cold, mocking voices. They echoed around him like the whispers of forgotten souls, each word a chilling reminder that there was no way out. "End of the line," they hissed, the words reverberating in his mind, twisting his thoughts, suffocating him with the promise of doom. No escape, no way back. The train finally began to slow, its pace gradually reducing until it came to a grinding halt. For a moment, the only sound that filled the air was the soft creak of the train's body settling into place. Silence returned, but it wasn't the kind of silence one might expect after such a journey. It was thick, oppressive, like a presence, watching and waiting. Arjun dared to move, his limbs heavy and uncooperative as if the very air had weight. Slowly, he stumbled to his feet, his gaze locked on the door ahead of him. He had to leave this place, had to know what waited beyond the confines of this nightmare. But deep down, a part of him feared what he might find. The door, once a barrier, between him and the unknown, now seemed like the last sliver of hope. Yet it was also the doorway to a final, terrifying answer. His hands trembled as he approached it, each step feeling like a slow march toward the inevitable. He reached for the handle, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. As he turned it, the door opened with an eerie creak, revealing an empty, desolate platform. The night stretched endlessly before him, a vast emptiness that seemed to go on forever. There were no sounds, no lights, only the darkness swallowing everything in its path. Arjun stepped out, his feet meeting the cold, hard ground. The air, around him stagnant and unnaturally still. The platform was eerily quiet, and the train, now behind him, seemed to have disappeared into the void. No tracks were visible, no signs of life. It was as if the world itself had vanished, leaving only this haunting, empty place. He turned around to look at the train one last time, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it was all a bad dream. But there was nothing. No train, no sign that it had ever existed. Only the vast, empty nothingness. A shiver ran down his spine as the whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding him from all sides. "You've reached the end," they taunted, their voices chilling and mocking. "No more running, no more escape." The realization hit him like a wave crashing over him. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of something far worse. Something had followed him, something he couldn't escape, and he would never leave this place. The train, the faceless man, the whispers, they had all led him, here, to the final stop. And in that moment, Arjun understood with a terrifying clarity that the train had never truly stopped. It had simply taken him to a place from which there was no return.